All that I can hope is you take me with you when you go. I guess I should have known I can't leave with you when you go. Now Cow Island is awfully quiet, with your screen door staying closed. And if I learned French like you told me, baby, I would hear your ghost.
And that, ladies and gentlemen, is your welcome to the final regular episode of the Panjwai Podcast.
'Tis indeed. We are here at the end, and in the spirit of the occasion, pun not intended. I guess it's not really a spirit.
It's not a spirit.
I have to drink some Coors Banquets while we see this thing out.
Absolutely. For those of you who maybe didn't catch the announcements or are catching up with the show ex post facto, months or years down the road, this is the final episode of the Panjwai Podcast. This is the last weekly release. This is the last time that we're releasing an episode because we have to. There's always the chance we might come back down the road and tell a specific story or do something here and there, but for all intents and purposes, you can consider this episode 52. The end of our journey of telling you the story, our story of Panjwai and the stories that we've collected of Panjwai.
Yeah, so Curtis and I always knew that this would have an end date. We just didn't know when and where. For us, it was always about telling the story. It's like when we got to a point where we felt like we told the story to the best of our ability, then we knew that we were going to, box it up and put it on a shelf. And over the past few episodes and the past couple months, we've realized we feel like the story is pretty well encapsulated. Obviously, it's impossible to get everybody's story in there, but we've done, thankfully, through the engagement with you all, the community around this thing, we've been able to cover a wide spread of people, time periods, different armies. And so we're feeling pretty confident that the story of Panjwai has been told the best way we know how. So, that was one factor into the decision as well.
And the other thing is, and we've hit on this a lot of times on the show, and I know it's going to offend some of you because your time in Panjwai was this big moment in your life, and you relive it all the time. And it's really important to you. But we really feel that it's not healthy to dwell and focus and speak on this one tiny moment of our lives indefinitely. Like, I couldn't imagine being a healthy, functioning person and continuing to just drone on and on and on about Panjwai forever. I would rather tell the story, do it in an 18-month window, put 50 interviews on the books, and like Luke said, put it on a shelf, maybe come back to it later. But, this idea of, doing this indefinitely on and on and on. I know it's not good for my mental health. I know it's not good for Luke's mental health. And I would just encourage all of you to, when you get to this point of the podcast, or at any point, just take a break. It's not your entire life. Start looking forward. Start looking at the next thing in your life.
Yeah, I mean, that's something that we've driven home a lot over the course of creating the podcast. And I feel like with the trajectory of the podcast has kind of aligned itself well with my own personal journey of reconnecting with this particular side of myself. So for me, it's been a point of reconnection and almost a self-discovery in some ways. But also, yes, I'm glad to be done talking about it because, it's, as veterans, especially those of us who didn't serve, 20-something years in some kind of special operations unit or whatever, of course, that's your identity. If you've just done your 4 years and you got your 2 deployments in and you got out, it shouldn't be the only thing that, that you talk about, harp on about. It shouldn't be the only facet of your identity. So that's one of the reasons that we're stopping. Because it's not the only thing that makes us who we are. But we are stopping at a high point.
Yes. And that's actually a question that we've gotten a few times from people about why are we stopping? Is it because you're not getting enough traction? Is it because you're not getting the guests or the views? Guys, let me tell you how incredible you have been as a community. Luke actually currently works professionally in the podcast space. Not forever, but he does right now. And I'll let him speak to that a little bit as well. But the top 50% of podcasts, you are a top 50% podcaster if you get 28 downloads of a new episode in its first week.
Mm-hmm.
Last week's episode with General Abrams got over 800 downloads in its first week, which makes it a top 5% podcast by those metrics. You guys have blown it out of the water with your support. By the time this airs, we'll be approaching 80,000 downloads, over 50,000 YouTube views, and over 20,000 Facebook views. We have been on Fox News, NBC News, the Hazard Ground podcast. We're on another podcast that's coming out next year that you'll find out more about later. We have definitely not failed to reach a level of success that we're disappointed with or something like that. We are beyond happy with what the podcast has achieved, which makes it even more important for us to leave because we feel like it's better to leave when the podcast is doing well, when it's a good product that we're proud of, than to let it just go on for 6 months and then wither away into nothing. As it is right now, I've been getting lazier and lazier with my editing. So, it's definitely best to leave on a high note. This has only been possible because of what you guys have put into it. Your donations, your time, sharing our posts, encouraging your friends to listen to it, reaching out to us and telling us things or sharing your pictures with us, helping us grow the social media community. It's 100% on you guys. There's nothing special about Luke and I that has made this podcast successful. It has nothing to do with us. It has 100% to do with you.
Yeah, it's been humbling in a lot of ways to see how many people are invested in this story, and I think it speaks to the power of a place, a small little place in Afghanistan, in that it's significantly larger and it's reached more ears, if you will, than Curtis and I ever anticipated when we started out. We thought maybe our immediate bubble of guys and maybe some family members and friends would be interested, but to get literally tens of thousands of interactions with it, and to get a few thousand people really interested in the story itself is kind of fascinating. I didn't expect that, and I see it speaks to the power of the experience of Panjwai. Like, Panjwai is an odd place, and we've talked about it a lot on the podcast, but it has this unique grip on the people that go there. I mean, guys who spent deployments elsewhere, like myself, I went to Iraq. I never think about Iraq like I do Panjwai. It's just a totally different world. And so that community that surrounds it, the brief tenure of time, especially that American forces were there, it's pretty strong and prevalent. And that's been demonstrated to us over the course of making this thing. So that's been cool to see.
Yeah, absolutely. And, that's actually a pretty great transition, because one thing we really wanted to do with this episode is close the loop, so to speak. When episode 1, we introduced you to Panjwai, if you weren't already familiar. We set out the landscape and some of the history and some of the military history and our personal histories, how we got there, what was Spurwingar like, who was Bravo Company 164, what was it like to walk in Panjwai, et cetera, et cetera. And, we had questions then that we didn't have the answers to. And then there were also questions, there were answers that we learned later in the podcast that we didn't even know we were asking the questions for. So we wanted to take a little bit of this episode to kind of close the loop on Panjwai, answer some of those unanswered questions. I know, Luke, when you started this with me, what was one of the big questions that you had?
I think one of the big questions, like high level, bird's eye questions that I had is, how did Panjwai fit into the scheme of not just the immediate area, but Kandahar and Afghanistan as a whole? And that's certainly something that's been answered in a few different ways from multiple angles. It's we always hear this line: it's the birthplace of the Taliban, it's the homeland of the Taliban. But I don't think I really understood the significance of that in terms of the kind of politic of Afghanistan as a whole until we started talking to some of the higher ranked people that we've interacted with, because they were able to shed some light on like why Panjwai was always a hot ticket, because it was such a crucial part of their identity as an organization and as an entity. So that's been pretty cool to get the peek behind the curtain on some of that.
And we got to speak to some really powerful guests to that exact topic. It's probably the first guest we got a real good behind the scenes glance was when we talked to Major Persons, who was our company commander. Our platoon leader in 2012, and ultimately became a major in the SFAB, Security Force Assistance Brigade, and he went back to Panjwai as a major and got a little bit more behind the scenes as to the local politics and to understand how there's the power structures there. I'm going to definitely encourage you to go back and listen to that episode. It's fascinating. And then we started talking to people like Rusty Bradley, who was in and out of Panjwai, what is it, 6 times?
Something crazy like that.
Over the course of his career. He's always back there. And so he had these relationships and he understood. And then, Colonel Rutherford, General Abrams, we start to get this big picture of essentially the fact that, Panjwai is a family-dominated landscape.
Mm.
There's a few families and they run the whole thing. And if you look at Kandahar as a whole, Kandahar is brutally important to the Taliban's overall strategy. And most people would say, well, then Kandahar city is their prize jewel. And that's it's a prize for them, but it's not their heart. Their heart is in Panjwai Zari.
Mm-hmm.
Mullah Muhammad Omar was born in Zari. His first wife is from the village of Sperwan. The Diamond's Back, Zangabad Gar, is where he showed off the cloaks that they took from Kandahar city. They launched their campaign at the Taliban out of Panjwai, to seize Kandahar city. It's super important to them, and not just as a motions. Their rat lines come across the Registan Desert, across the Dowry Route, and into the Horn of Panjwai. That is how they get their food, supplies, medicine, weapons, ammunition.
Yeah. And I think, it's strategically important, and it had a lot of spiritual and emotional importance for them. So, it speaks to the level of determination that they held on to that ground with. Because, we were in Panjwai in terms of like, Western forces were in Panjwai for a long period of time. And the fight was always there, always intense. From 2001 and 2 when Americans first pushed into the area, and then from 2006 on after the Canadians and SF forces pushed in there, from 06 to 14, it was a hotly contested piece of land, and that speaks to their determination to hold the line on that, because it would have been easy for them to bend the knee and give way after they took a hammering down there for 6 years. And they definitely took a hammering for 6 years.
Oh, yeah. And kind of looking back even before when we got to Panjwai, we had some questions about the history of the landscape. We talked about the irrigation canals and the dams and all, the modern infrastructure that's there. There are modern wells, there are modern canals. Like the Dowry Route and the Arghandab are definitely used to irrigate Zari and Panjwai. And we were wondering, when did that go in? And we found out it came in the 1950s. So it was mostly United States and UN resources that built a lot of these modern irrigation, not systems. Equipment, but systems. Yeah. There you go. We also, like we said, Mullah Omar was born in Zari. His wife is from Sperwan. We never got a firm answer about the Sperwan Gar Hill itself. But based on some other research into similar mounds in the area, reading a little bit about what the Russians did there and knowing what we know about the schoolhouse, our best guess is that the mound dates back to the Byzantine era, Alexander the Great, probably 2,000-3,000 years old. It may have been built onto a little bit by the Russians, but the mound itself dates back to then. The plateau on which the schoolhouse is built, definitely back to the Russians. And then the schoolhouse was built in the early 90s. So Spurwingar is actually this, conglomeration of multiple eras. And I'm sure it was used by the British at some point too. I can't rule that out.
Yeah.
But it's a kind of an assemblage of different eras of combat that we added to as well. I mean, we changed what it looked like. We added things to it. But that's the best guess, is that, we originally thought that it had been built by the Russians, and I don't believe that that's the case anymore.
Yeah. We do know that we were sleeping next to a 1,000-pound JDAM lodged in a hill that didn't go off.
Yeah. Yeah, we learned that from Zach Harrison, who actually no, we learned it from Tom. Thomas Young told us about that.
Yeah.
So everyone who served on Spurwingar, you were literally living next to a ticking time bomb. It probably wouldn't have killed you. That's probably, unless you were on top of the hill, then it might have killed you. But if you were like in the schoolhouse, it just would have been a horrible day. You would have been buried under half the mountain. Your eardrums would have been blown out, and you've been like, "What just happened?"
Oh man, that's too good. And that was from before 2006, I think.
It was. I think Tom said it predated Medusa.
Yeah, which is 03 or something like that. They made a push to do that. That's another thing that was kind of interesting about the history of Panjwai too, is it's kind of murky in a lot of ways. Like, so many units came in and out of there, and like it wasn't like, the Korengal or something where dudes came and they spent 15 months and they were there and they on this one fire base for 15 months. It was a constant flux and ebb and flow of units. So to really recreate the history has been kind of difficult in that regard, because there's so many people that came through that area. And like we said earlier, if they were there for 10 days or if they were there for 10 months, it impacted them.
And in general, I mean, where it gets real hard is before like 2005. That's when you're like, you had SF that was in and out of there. You had other countries' SF that was in and out of there. We had conventional forces in and out. The Marines were in Panjwai at one point. But they're constantly moving. And when the Canadians started rotating in, they would rotate around, and they didn't stay in one place for anything more than maybe a week or two, hang out at the district center or maybe at Massamgar. And it's also important to mention that when we talk to the Canadians, when we say Panjwai, for them, it's Zari too. Because Zari was part of Panjwai up until like 2008, when they formally split the district and created Zari out of parts of Panjwai and Maiwand. So it gets even murkier when you're looking into the history of Panjwai, because some people are saying Panjwai and they mean Zari. So you have these Canadian units rotating around. It's not until 2006 that you can start to really tell the story. There were a lot of SFODAs that went in and got fucked up in Panjwai before 2006. And we didn't get to tell those stories, and I wish we would have had the time. Because, there was a lot of sacrifice and lives lost in Panjwai way before Medusa. Unfortunately for us amateur historians, it kind of starts with Medusa, with the Canadians. But even while the Canadians held Panjwai, you had American forces kind of poking their nose in there because they were bored, essentially. That's basically our explanation for why the 101st went into Panjwai. They were bored. They had nothing else to do. You had, and even the Canadians, they did different things, whether it was a mechanized unit or a French Canadian unit or Princess Patricia light infantry unit. They all operated a little bit differently. For example, the JTF-2, their Delta Force, they basically owned the area around Zangabad and wouldn't let anybody over there. So for years, everyone thought that nobody was in Zangabad. That's why the 101st guys thought they were the first ones ever there. Yeah, because JTF-2 just put a circle around it and said no one is allowed to go in here except for us. That's not something. I mean, we learned that by accident. So yeah, absolutely a murky military history. The Canadians fought super hard, but they all fought differently, and they did 6 months deployments. So we spoke with a Canadian infantryman, Princess Patricia light infantry, and he said it was very frustrating to him to hear us talk about learning these lessons when they had learned it, 2 years earlier. but the lessons didn't pass down because of this short-term troop turnover and the arrogance that is kind of inherent in troops when they take over.
I mean, I feel like it just comes with the territory of being, the infantry and being that kind of gung-ho, put my dick on the table and let everybody else. Maybe I shouldn't say it that way.
That's fine. Who cares? It's the last episode.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, it speaks to that attitude of like, I'm going to put my dick on the table and everybody's going to look at it, and this is how it's going to be. I feel like that discontinuity across all those units is it's interesting to see, because the Panjwai lessons were hard. They were hardly learned, and I feel like if there's any leaders that listen to this thing, it's like a little bit of humility goes a long way. Humility can go a long way towards protecting your guys and protecting their lives and well-being. So keeping an open ear. And I feel like, personally, I went into it just, I don't know, completely. I was an open book in a lot of ways, but I was also so focused on getting out of the military that I didn't even really want to think about having to apply myself to it. It was much more of like okay, I'm going to do my job and knock it out and get done,
Well, and the thing is, there's a couple different kinds of units. I felt as us as a very young unit, we were eager to learn from the unit before us. Mm-hmm. Unfortunately, the unit before us wasn't very eager to teach us.
Yeah.
They were ready to go home, and they'd stopped patrolling for quite a while. And we're not talking shit, guys. We're not saying you didn't do your job. You did your job. But your leaders kind of quit on you. And that's not your fault. Mm-hmm. But, we didn't get much of a handoff. The unit wasn't patrolling much, beyond the eyesight of Spur One Gar. And so what we thought was a good handover turned out not to be, because, just the information didn't get handed down. And if you track back, so the Canadians that had Spur One Gar last handed it off to, 5-1 Cav, who got switched out midway through their deployment with 2 battalions on Spur One Gar, 321 Cav and 321 infantry and 15 infantry. And it happened very fast and very close to the end of their deployments. Like, there was no kind of coherent changeover because they were just in constant disarray. And again, it's not your fault, guys. It's just the way that it happened. It just is what it is. And as a result of that, a lot of lessons learned got lost. Mm-hmm. So by the time we took over, lessons that the Canadians had spent 6 years learning, we didn't get the benefit of that, which was unfortunate.
Yeah, for sure. I feel like that stems from the kind of fractured nature of units coming and going. Because another thing is, like, a lot of units spent a lot less time there.
Yes,
they were there for 3 or 4 months, and either they were made combat ineffective, or their deployments were ending, or just whatever multitude of reasons that kind of catapulted them towards wrapping things up. So yeah, I guess we could kind of shrink the view down a little bit and start thinking about a little bit more of our experience then.
So, we got there, like I said, very young unit. I think that kind of worked to our advantage to not know what we were experiencing at the time. And that's something that kind of came up with several of our guests, particularly Alex Berner and Ronnie Morgan, who said, yeah, it was real bad, and we didn't tell you guys it was real bad because we didn't want to mess with your head.
Yeah.
Because I think a lot of us were like, hey, this is combat. This is normal. And it wasn't normal.
Yeah, that was a really interesting revelation for me, because I had always viewed it as just another combat, your typical infantry deployment. And I didn't quite understand the unique nature in terms of the intensity and the violence of that deployment until we started talking to other people through the podcast, until we had other deployments to frame it by. And I think one of the things that I think about a lot was when I was in basic training, and I had a drill sergeant who had been to Iraq multiple times at that point, and he always said, like, it's real quiet. It'll be quiet for 3 or 4 months. And then there's one day where just they turn it on and it's a shit show for an entire day. And so that was here lately. I've been thinking about that little anecdote, and I was like, man, that wasn't the case for us. Like, it was real quiet for a week. And then there would be that one day. But I think the difference being is like the violence was evenly spread with the occasional bump in intensity and how violent it was. But it was pretty much the same across the entire 9 months. Like, you knew what to expect. When fighting season really kicked in, you knew what to expect. And I just didn't understand that wasn't normal for GWAT. I didn't understand that fighting typically ebbed and flowed.
Yeah, and I think grind is a really good way to describe if you had used one word to describe combat in Panjwai, it was a grind. And we're, like I said, we're not taking away from anybody else's experiences in any parts of the country. We know that Korengal was tough. We know that Helmand was a shit show. We know that even in the mountains like Uruzgan, there's a lot of horrible fighting. Like there was a lot of bad places in Afghanistan.
Mm-hmm.
But they're all a little bit different. Mountain fighting was extremely physically demanding. And the gunfights came rarer, but when they came, they were more intense. You were engaged from longer distances. It was harder to shoot back with your M4 when they're engaging with a Dishka at 2,000 meters.
Mm-hmm.
But they also got really brutally close. I mean, guys got snagged and kidnapped in the mountains. That kind of stuff happened. For us, it was very, like you said, very consistent. You had, the IED threat, which forced your maneuvers into single file lines. You avoided the roads whenever possible. You're breaking down walls. You're moving in grape rows, and you're getting engaged within 100 to 200 meters every time.
Mm-hmm.
Up to like the closest
feet.
was like 10.
Yeah.
You're talking 50 feet away. You're seeing guys. And Kyle's talking about seeing a guy put a PKM on the wall right in front of his face. This shit happened at very close ranges. Grenade range. Legit grenade range. We're not talking about Rangers hitting an objective and there being guys at grenade range, because the Rangers put themselves in grenade range. They put them. They were able to get within grenade range of us without our ISR overhead aircraft seeing them.
Yeah, that was definitely part of the unique nature of the fight there, is how close it was. And that's something that a lot of Afghan veterans that served in other places in the country, when I hear interviews or whatever, they always talk about the distance. And it's always been a weird thing for me to hear guys talk about, we would get hit from 600 or 700 meters out because they knew the effective range of the M4. And I'm like, man, we got hit from 50 feet. We get hit from, 5 feet sometimes. It was, there was multiple occasions where it was super, super close. And then there was never outside of 200 meters. It was always within 200 meters. So it was just kind of weird to know that area is unique in that regard, and that the fighting is different. And like we said, it's more of a grind. I feel like for the mountain boys, the typical thing would be lulls and then a really bad day where they're fighting like 25 guys, And for us, it was that grind, and that we didn't fight huge numbers of dudes, but it was always really close and it was constant. So like I remember asking Morgan, I said, what's worse, like fighting 25 guys from across the mountain valley or fighting 2 dudes from 30 feet away? It's like, I don't know which one's worse, but I can tell you which one's scarier. And that little anecdote stuck with me too, that line has. So yeah, I mean, it was a wild time.
and I think if you take the IEDs out of the equation, those two situations are kind of a wash,
Mm-hmm.
Like on one hand, you're getting shot at a lot, but it's short-lived. You have air support on short tether.
Mm-hmm.
We never really were in a whole lot of danger in gunfights. We did lose, our two, Sergeant Swindle and Corporal Luxmore. They were lost to small arms fire, so obviously it was very dangerous.
And Brazos.
And Brazos was small arms fire.
Mm-hmm.
But even still, if you asked me to pick between the two, I honestly wouldn't make a decision. They're just like, just send me where you're going to send me.
Yeah.
The IEDs changed the game. Because of the unique geography and topography of Panjwai. You can't escape them.
Yeah. The
There's
sheer
nothing you can do about
proliferation of IEDs
Everywhere.
dominated everything. Like, I mean, it I feel like in the mountains again, I don't know. I never deployed to the mountains, but I feel like for them, it was like, when's the big one going to kick off? Like the big IED, the 400 pounder that's going to take out a Humvee. And for us, it was just like how many 10-pound, how many 400 10-pound IEDs are scattered between here and that next village. And so they would definitely were the solidification of our fight for sure.
Yeah, and it's weird to explain, and I'm glad that many of our guests reaffirm this, that they weren't actually trying to kill us.
Mm-hmm.
And it's a real mind fuck.
Mm-hmm.
When your enemy is not actually trying to kill you. If they kill you, they're overjoyed. Great, but that's not their goal.
Mm-hmm.
Their goal is to affect your movement, to keep you away from places they don't want you to go, or to end your patrol early, or to demoralize you. And if they kill you, it's like a bonus. But if they really wanted to kill us, all they had to do was double the size of all those charges.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that was the thing. Is like all these small charges scattered all over the place, and if you blow a dude's foot off, then you've dealt a blow to your enemy. You know, you've completely mind fucked your enemy if they know that when they take a step, they could lose a part of their body at best. Mm-hmm. And so, you know, they were the masters of using that sneaky little device known as the IED.
And also kind of what it's like to pull up a little bit. You know, when we talked to Avery about flying the Kiowa over Panjwai at that time, you know, we had a very micro perception of what was going on. We went out on our patrols, and we saw what we saw, and we knew what happened to other platoons on the base. But outside of that, we only kind of got a periphery. Like, what was Alpha 123 up to? What was Bravo 123 up to? All that stuff. But when we talked to Avery, he's like, no, man. He's like, everybody was in it every day.
Yeah.
You know, he's like, he's bouncing from firefight to firefight to firefight to firefight, or to IED hit or whatever. Like, the idea that he was up in the air, and he said he never saw a firefight to completion.
Yeah. Yeah, he was getting pulled somewhere else. Like, I mean, across the entire district, especially in the Horn, it was just, it's like the kinetic, to use the military terminology, the kinetic nature of it was relentless, man. And so when you got, you know, multiple companies out there, it was something every day, multiple times a day. I don't know. Spicy.
Very. And, you know, it's a good way to talk about what 123 was up to on the deployment, because we talked about Spur One Gar quite a bit. Mm-hmm. You know, and what we did with Spur One Gar. We've had some opportunities to talk about what was going on, say, Zangabad and, you know, Mushan in particular, Taliban, Cop Lion. You know, and essentially, you know, talking to Colonel Rutherford and talking to Brent Buffington, got a really good idea that basically Alpha 123 just got fucked up.
Mm-hmm.
You know, if I had to pick who had the worst deployment, by far it goes to Alpha 123 at Cop Mushan. Mm. They had no standoff. They had a shitty base. They lived like, you know, we expected to live, you know, on cots and GP mediums with barely working AC and no standoff from the enemy. They were getting hit right outside their wire. Horrendous attrition. You know, they lost two guys. They lost DeMarsico and they lost Navarro, and they had a couple double and triple amputees. I mean, they had a rough deployment.
Yeah.
You know, Charlie 123 at Zangabad had it a little bit easier. And I don't think that's because it's not, obviously, again, it's not your fault, guys. And I know you got fucked up because we got fucked up with you one day. When you had your massive mass casualty on August 23rd, you know, we had a guy lose his leg trying to get to you. So we know you had a hard deployment. We're not saying that. But I feel like the fight at Spur One Gar and Mushan kind of drew fighters away from Zangabad. And also the SFODA at Bellenbai drew some people away. So Charlie had it a little bit easier. And then you had Bravo down at Taliban, had a good fight. But Taliban had a lot of open ground around it. It wasn't quite as in the Great Bros as Mushan was. And then Cop Lion, I'm not sure who was down there. And then you had Soja and Kenjikak too. You know, we can't forget about Soja and Kenjikak. Soja had elements of, I think, 520. And was it 520 and 117 were in and out of Soja. And they basically just ran, they just filled in gaps throughout Panjwai wherever it was needed, because Soja itself was kind of a large base that wasn't really next to anything. Mm-hmm. And then Kenjikak, which is where our second platoon of infantrymen were, and our Charlie company of tankers from 164 was at. They had a rough deployment too. I mean, it wasn't as kinetic. Not as many firefights, but they did. They had one of our guys, one of our infantrymen, stepped on an ID and lost his leg, Cottrell. They had some pretty brutal fights as well, and they lived in shitty housing, like they did in Mushan and stuff. So like, one thing that is a regret of mine is that just by nature of not enough time, we didn't get to tell all these stories. But nobody who served with 123 in Panjwai should come away from their service feeling anything less than like you did a fucking monumental task in in the most dangerous district of the country in 2012.
Yeah. That, I mean, it was a significant period of time. The longevity too of the unit as well. Like the Panjwai chewed units up and spit them out, and the fact that all of the units were able to stay at their posting for a 9-month deployment was kind of miraculous in a lot of ways. Like, because it wasn't uncommon for different units to get plussed up or to get filtrated out. And I know we experienced a lot of turnover in terms of our own guys, and I'm sure other units did that as well. But the fact that, the companies were able to hold their own across that entire district and to be spread thin. This is an area that traditionally would have a brigade in there, and we have one battalion trying to handle all this. That's the reason we ended up there to begin with, because they needed some extra hands on deck.
Well, and it's interesting you mentioned that, because the battalion before us, or the units on Sparrowing Guard, did get switched out mid-tour because they were declared combat ineffective, because they got hit so many times.
Yeah.
So they didn't do their full year deployment in any one place. We barely did our 9 months. There was talk of us being swapped out towards the end. And if the things if we had a year deployment, I'm almost sure we probably would have been swapped out. If October 4th had happened in July, we might have been swapped out. I know General Abrams wanted to swap us out. And I'm glad that they didn't.
Me too. Yeah.
Now, at the time, I was hoping for it. I
was like, yes, let's leave. Fuck.
Right. But being able to see that job to our completion is a sense of pride for me. And again, this doesn't take away from anybody that had to step away or had to take care of themselves along the course. But me personally, I am exceptionally proud of the fact that I was on the line from day one until the day we left Sparrowing Guard. That is a sense of pride for me.
Yeah. Same for me, man. And that's not something that I really... this is just a thanks to people who have come onto the podcast as guests, and also people that we've interacted with over the course of creating it. Is that was never something for me before that I like found pride in, or that I was able to stand on as a point of pride. But I feel like personally, having gone through this experience, I can step away from it and be proud of what we did there, and be proud of my time there, and proud of myself, something I never thought to be proud of. I don't know how self-congratulatory that sounds, but I am, in a way, and I'm appreciative that I was able to hold out, especially how close I was to getting out of the military. So as I'm getting older and I'm moving through life, I'm glad we stayed. I'm glad that our unit was able to stay and fight to the very end. The last patrol was a fight. So
yeah, and that's one thing, this idea of being proud of your service, that has come up quite a bit on the podcast as well. We mentioned it in the first 2 episodes. It's come up several times, particularly when Afghanistan was falling and people were struggling with that. And I kind of wanted to take a moment to shut down this pogue hating bullshit. This idea that just because you were an infantryman or you were combat arms, that your contribution somehow matters more. Did you have it harder? Probably. You probably had a harder deployment than some of the people you're talking shit to. That's probably true. That doesn't make you any better than them. It doesn't make their contribution to the fight any less valuable, and it doesn't mean that they should be any less proud of their contribution to the fight.
Yeah, and ditto to other units that didn't see as much shit. Like, war sucks, no matter where you're at and how intense it is or how kinetic it is. Like, war always sucks. So whether you're delivering the fucking mail and running the risk of hitting a 500-pound IED that melts you into the concrete, or if you're out there just grinding it out on Sperwangar or Mushan or Lion or whatever, you should be proud of what you did, man. And like, nobody's devalidated in what they did because of the nature of their job. They chose to do the job, and then the job took them to an extreme place and put them in extreme situations. And a lot of people have done very, very well in those situations. It is a point of pride for everybody, no matter what background or what MOS you had or whatever.
And, if you're the kind of person that has been living your life for the past 10 years, talking shit about other people because they didn't do what you did, you need a self-check.
Yeah.
You need to reevaluate.
The back window.
Yeah, take your ERB off the back window. Stop living in that moment. Like, yes, you did something worthy of honor and worthy of recognition. But the minute you start flaunting it over other people who either didn't have the opportunity or privilege to do it, that kind of makes you a piece of shit.
Yeah, so definitely. And the thing is, my joke is that the more stickers in the windshield, the less shit they actually saw.
Well, there's truth to that too, but there are people that saw shit and they just think it validates them, and it's not that it invalidates you. It's just that, like I said, yes, other people had it easier. Other people had a different deployment. Other people chose not to go down that road, and that's fine.
Mm-hmm. The thing is that you're allowed to be more than that. Don't hold yourself back in that the only thing you ever done of significance was go to war, because there's bajillions of other things in life that you can apply yourself to and become even better for it. And because of your experiences in the military, you can be a better father or a better husband, or you can perform well in your chosen field, or you can go to school or become a tradesman or whatever it is you choose to apply yourself to. Like, use I feel like for me, again, I can only speak from my experience, but the great benefit and the gift of this podcast has been learning to utilize that experience as a means by which to set myself up for something better down the road. And that's not something that I did before. I never used my military experience as a means of making myself better. It was always just a shut closet in the back of my mind. So to learn to do that, it's been beneficial. And I think everybody else can pull from that too. Like, use it as something to make yourself better, but don't let it be the only thing that you are, because you can be more than that. We can all be better than that. We can be better veterans. Be a better veteran.
And if there's something I wish that we would have spent more time on, it would definitely have been that whole idea of being a better veteran.
Yeah.
Because the veteran community has its plus and minuses, and I think we've seen the full spectrum.
Mm-hmm.
I'll be the first to admit I was super empowered by the veteran community's response to the fall of Afghanistan. To see guys helping get interpreters out, and going there and pulling people out, or using their own money to charter planes and stuff like that. It was fucking cool, man. It was the embodiment of selflessness and duty and sacrifice and honor. And then you freaking contrast that with Tim Kennedy, guys like that, fucking straight up vet bros being fucking douches and fucking it up, which they did. They went and they grabbed the wrong people, and it's a whole other story, but it doesn't matter. The point is, be better. And we were better. We were so good. We did such a great job. And in the same token, it's been really cool to see vets volunteer and go help fight with Ukraine. Whatever the politics of that is, I don't care. If you're going there because you believe in it and you think that you can help innocent people and you're doing that for free, just go for it, man. That's so fucking cool. Way better than hosting a fucking self-righteous podcast about your experience for 18 months.
Yeah, for sure. And that's actually been one of the challenges of this for both of us, I know, is like overcoming that hypocrisy. Unwillingness to self-promote, because that is antithetical to my entire being, is to sit around and talk about the things that I did. But that being said, I feel like we did a pretty good job of highlighting the things that our guests did. And we've had some awesome guests along the way.
Yeah. And I wish we could go through each and every one of them and tell you what we liked about them. And we thought about doing that, but then we realized how long that would fucking take.
Yeah.
But I do want to put you on the spot, Luke. What was your, I don't want to say favorite. What interview meant the most to you?
I think our interview with Tom Evans.
Okay.
Probably meant the most to me because that was an experience that haunted me for a long time. And talking to Tom, especially for such a long period of time, it was nice to, for one, reconnect with somebody who I always had a strong connection with, especially when we were in the military. Like we just kind of clicked, to reconnect with him and then to hear the story of those couple of days from someone who got wounded was very, very beneficial for me. It helped me. It helped me heal. It helped me to close the door on that memory in a lot of ways. So yeah, that was one that really stuck out to me. How about you?
So I'm going to cheat and say two of them, and then only because there's a link between them. Mm-hmm. The first one is our first interview with Matt Kohler. Mm-hmm. There was a few reasons why that one was particularly powerful for me. One was that it was our first guest interview. Mm-hmm. So it was an emotional ride, man. It was crazy. It was 4 hours of like the pre-interview was 6 hours. And we were crying in the pre-interview, and Matt, he was super brutally honest about his struggle with mental health and what that deployment did to him. And then him putting you on the spot to talk about your moment. It was very, very powerful. But the thing that really stood out was when he talked about the day that Clark got hit. He was he holds that in his heart so deep. And the reason I mentioned too is when Clark came up for his interview, when we got to hear Clark's side of it, which was super powerful. But what was really wild is when I was taking Clark back to the airport, after he had done his interview and everything, I let him listen to that section of Kohler's interview. It hadn't come out yet. And it affected him so deeply hearing it from Kohler's point of view, because up to this point, he had kind of held it against Kohler a little bit. He never said it, but he did. And Kohler kind of knew it, and they were friends, but that tension that hatchet hadn't been buried yet. Yeah. It hadn't been addressed. And so to hear Kohler talk about it and to hear how much it deeply affected Kohler and kind of fucked up Clark. And Clark actually missed his flight in Seattle because he was not in a headspace where he could get back on an airplane. And that led to Clark reaching out to Kohler and them talking about it and kind of reaching that closure. But yeah, so for that reason, I think that was the most impactful for me. But being that a couple other ones that stood out that I really enjoyed, Matt, the civilian researcher, that was a really cool episode. Obviously, Rusty Bradley episodes, the Captain Kitching episode, Tom's episode, Ronnie Morgan's episode was really good. Really good. Alex Berner's episode. Rutherford, Abrams, just had some really cool conversations with people.
Yeah, and I feel like, on the subject of Clark and Kohler, and they're kind of reconnecting and things like that, like the amount of healing that's come out of this has been pretty astounding too, for you and I. But for people that have come on, like there's guys that have come on who have told stories that they've not even said to their spouses because they're struggling with these things. And so definitely the most rewarding aspect of this is allowing for reconnections between people like Kohler and Clark, and to kind of allow for some burying of hatchets and allow for the beginning processes of healing around these memories that, haunt some people or carry a lot of weight with others. And so that's been very nice.
And even you bring up a really good point about spouses reaching out. Alex Berner's spouse reached out and thanked us for having him tell his story because he hadn't told her that stuff. He hadn't talked about it. but then there was like this second order effect that I didn't plan for. I worried about it early on, but I just didn't. There's nothing I can do to plan for it, which was the surviving family of those that were lost, hearing these stories. Over the course of the podcast, Ali Brazos, the family of Pinnock and Lily, the friends of Pinnock and Lily have reached out, family and friends. The Luxmore family. I haven't heard from Chelsea, but I'm pretty sure she's heard it as well. The DeMarsico family, the Navarro family. A lot of these families have reached out and thanked us for telling the stories about the days that their loved ones were killed. Because I guess just as a nature of the way it is, no one wants to sit down with a Gold Star mom and tell her that story in detail. They might get the broad strokes, but particularly when Alex talked about treating and evacuating BJ, that was really powerful. The guilt that he held and still holds for that and how it affected him. I know that they reached out to him to talk to him about it, and I think that's just, like you said, the healing that kind of started with people having these conversations. And I'm not going to take credit for that. I mean, anybody could have made a podcast and had the same result. Again, like I said at the beginning, this isn't anything special about you or I. It's about the community and how willing they were to put themselves out there.
Yeah, that was a pleasant surprise too, is the willingness of people to come on and not just have a conversation and yak it up and talk about, that great firefight that we had, but to get down to the nitty gritty and really tell some hard stories and to relive some hard memories. But the determination and willingness that a lot of the guests showed to do so was invigorating, because it was, it was beautiful in a way to see people come and just be brutally honest and brutally human, and to be open and exposed in a public format. And I think that created the space for a lot of folks to reach out and start connecting, because they realized, oh, I can do that. Right. It's okay for me to let this kind of be shown to the world for a little bit.
When you look across the 52 episodes, how many actual war stories came out of those episodes? Mm-hmm. Not honestly, not even that many. Mm-hmm. People were exceptionally willing to talk about the experience, how it felt, what it looked like, what it smelled like. We got some wonderful storytelling, from Rusty Bradley. And God, episode 2 of Rusty Bradley was just like reading the book, but better because he was telling it. But for the most part, people were very invested in telling what it meant to them. How it means to them going forward. People talking about their struggle with mental health, and that's pretty wild, because that's what we wanted. We didn't want to just tell war stories. We wanted something meaningful. We wanted to know what it meant to be a human being in that war zone, and we got that.
Yeah, for sure. And even, like I said, I think the brutal honesty, it comes back to that. People were willing to be honest about it, and that's another nature of the Panjwai fight, is it was very experiential in a lot of ways. I feel like for some dudes, it's the one big battle, or the one big operation, and that's kind of like that catalytic moment. But for us, it was, it was emblematic of the experience, that you dwell in the experience itself and not so much in your one moment, because those moments were scattered and those moments were a constant grind. So it was experiential, I think. Maybe that sets it apart. Maybe not. I don't know. We didn't deploy again to some other place, so I can't really say.
Right. It's when we think about the experience of being in Panjwai, it inevitably always comes back to, the people of Panjwai and of Afghanistan. Because it so much shaped our experience. We didn't just go around walking around these grape rows in a vacuum. We were in people's backyards. We were in their farmyards. We were in their homes and their villages. And we talked about in the last episode with Sarah that, I never felt a connection to the Afghan people just because I was an infantryman. I was told to pull security. But that doesn't mean that I wasn't very aware of it. And as we went through this process, becoming even more aware of it, as we get messages and emails, especially towards the fall of Afghanistan, of what was going on, I think it started to, right at that 10-year mark, especially appropriate, give me a better appreciation for what they had to go through.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I've said it before on the podcast, but, I'll say it again. That's kind of my final thoughts on the people of Afghanistan is my mind always goes to the girls. Because, those girls are destined to live a life of servitude and nothing more. And, they're not going to be afforded the opportunity to do anything more than what they're being forced into by the culture and circumstance into which they're born. So talking to Sarah, especially, it was really, really nice to see an example of an Afghan girl who's obviously gone well into modernity, and done very well for herself and succeeded. And that was always the thing that stuck with me about the people of Panjwai is like these girls, like if whatever we did there, whether it changed their lives or not, even if it didn't change their life, there was a girl in Kabul who was getting to go to school, or a girl in Kandahar who maybe got a taste of what it was like to make a decision for herself. And so those are the people that bear the brunt of it all. And while, the girls in that immediate area were probably suffering like they always have, and unfortunately will always continue to, somewhere else, a girl was able to be a person first and property, not be property.
And I give credit to some of the NATO commanders in recognizing that the people were the key terrain of Afghanistan.
Mm-hmm.
And I think to some extent General Abrams understood that. He talked about the district governor of Kandahar being a dual Canadian-Afghan citizen and being completely out of touch.
Mm-hmm.
With the culture and norms, and that it was General Abrams that had to insist that his Western daughter, dress modestly when going to visit these, village elders. Like the fact that he had to do that, for over someone who's a dual Afghan citizen, like what that story continues to blow my mind. Like how the district governor of Kandahar could have been so out of touch.
Mm.
So I'll give some credit where credit's due that they understood the people were the key terrain, but I think that that NATO forces, American military, mainly the State Department, because I'm gonna throw the fiasco of Afghanistan at their feet every chance I get. They misunderstood the people of Afghanistan and what it took to really stabilize Afghanistan and give it a chance. Which kind of leads into this inevitable conversation. What would we have done differently if we're up to us knowing what we know now with our hundreds of hours of interviews with people in Panjwai, with our interactions with local Pashtuns that lived there. I've got a list, but I'd be curious to hear what your thoughts are.
What I would have done differently. I mean, on what level?
The highest levels,
the highest
all
level possible.
Yeah.
I think
to make it to win the war.
Yeah, I would say committing and understanding that it's going to take generations, and that that's a physical, is here monetary or a physical price that the U.S. government or people weren't willing to pay. I think in a lot of ways, the Afghan war was not going to be won in 20 years, and it probably wasn't going to be won in 40 years. We probably would have started to see a lot of good in 60 years. And we probably could have turned it into what we wanted it to be in 100 years. And I feel like for me, it was just committing to it. And the thing about it is we proved in the last few years of the war that the commitment, it didn't need to be huge. It just needed to be enough.
Right.
And the complete unwillingness to commit even just some to help it maintain was kind of sad to see. Because that's what it would have taken as commitment. We made our bed, but we didn't want to sleep in it. It's basically what happened there. But with 10,000 troops on the ground and some air assets, it goes a long way in Afghanistan in 2000 18 and 19,
Yes. My list is long. And it really focuses on the fact that we misunderstood how to let Afghanistan fight for itself.
Mm-hmm.
Like I said, any chance, I'm throwing it at the State Department's feet. The United States State Department is so focused on the American version of democracy. They have blinders on to anything else that will work, even if American democracy can never work. American democracy cannot work in Afghanistan. It does. It's not possible. Afghanistan is not a melting pot. It can't work. But the State Department's mandate is to, American democracy abroad. That's their thing. And honestly, Stu, I know you work for the State Department, but they suck at it. And Afghanistan is completely their fault. And Iraq was their fault too, but that's a completely other topic. One thing that stands out to me is that's the idea of a central government was a bad idea to begin with. It never should have been. Afghanistan is not something that could be centrally controlled. The Pashtos don't want to work with the Uzbeks and the Tajiks and the Panjiris. They all have their own priorities, even down to the village level, different priorities than they might have from a village over them. There's a different system for that, and I'm not going to pretend to know what it is, but I know it's not a centralized American democracy. So that's the political side. As far as the military side, I think we made a few mistakes. One was, how we used SF later in the war. The way we used SF initially, brilliant. Embedding them with Mujahideen fighters and local warlords, using ODAs as basically these hubs in a network that allowed us to take over this country in a very short period of time over a superior force.
It's a textbook. The invasion of Afghanistan was like literally the textbook use of SF.
Absolutely. It was brilliant. And why? Because SF excels in those areas. They are, they're Peace Corps with guns, right? They speak the language, they learn the customs, they're small teams so that the likelihood of big mistakes is a lot less. They're independent thinkers, they're highly trained. That's who needs to be working with the Afghan people, not American infantry. The idea of having NATO conventional infantry embed with Afghan army, in my opinion, was a bad idea. It never should happen unless it was specially trained advisors like the SFAB or Special Forces ODAs. Those are the only ones that should have been embedded with Afghan army or police, because they're the best chance of not doing something stupid and making a cultural gaffe that creates a rift that results in a green on blue or something like that. Another was the regional alignment. If you are Afghan army or police and you are in a Pashto stronghold, you should be Pashto. I don't care if every Pashto soldier in Afghanistan is in that one district. There should never have been Uzbek or Tajik soldiers crawling around Panjwai, period. It was a recipe for disaster. I get it. They don't have a whole lot of Pashto in the ANA. That's fine. They need to prioritize assigning all of them to Kandahar and Helmand. Let's see my next list. So when I was in Korea, they had a program called the Katusas. I think I'm saying that right. Katusa. Yeah, Katusa. So in the South Korean has a program called the Katusa Program. So when you join the South Korean military, you can either become a South Korean soldier and part of their regular units, or if you're very smart, if you do really well on all the tests and you qualify really all these high qualifications, you can actually be a South Korean soldier in an American unit. And that's what they're called, the Katusas. And they would be in infantry units fighting alongside the American infantrymen, or they'd be in aviation units. They'd be like the clerks or something. Like they would be embedded in American units, and it was considered a high pride to be in these American units. Imagine if we had taken the same approach in Afghanistan. If exceptionally skilled, Afghan soldiers who knew English could serve in American units. And then they go back to their regular units as a hero and as a, oh wow, you got to be on the American base. But that should have been the only way that you should have had conventional forces integrated with Afghan forces, in my opinion. So the VSOs where the SF were, like towards the end of the war, I don't think that ever should have been an SF mission. That should have been a civil affairs mission. Those should have been civil affairs soldiers with conventional infantry at those bases to do that community outreach. I think SF was misused in that role. I think it led to SF somewhat, what's the word for it? Probably a lack of supervision, which led to them doing things they shouldn't have been doing. You know, Bellenby is a great example of that. Obviously, it wasn't the SF soldiers that walked off and did it, but a lot of things came out as a result of the investigation of what the SF soldiers were doing there. You know, and I think that probably just because they were bored. It's not the mission they signed up for. It's not what they want to do. They don't want to sit on a base and go do presence patrols. You know, they signed up for more than that. And then, you know, one thing I really would have liked to see is the younger soldiers in no matter what unit more exposed to the culture and the people. You know, certainly. We were used as security, which is our job, granted, but you know, you're always looking over your shoulders, like, wonder what they're talking about. I would love to, you know, have a conversation with that guy, but the interpreter is with the PL talking to the village elder, and I'm never going to be a part of that conversation.
Yeah,
maybe that last one is kind of like just like a fairy tale. But I think everything else would have gone a long way towards shaping the fight a little bit differently.
I mean, on the topic of your last point, I think that allowing junior soldiers a glimpse in to the workings a little bit more on every level would be beneficial because, you know, from a tactical standpoint, it allows them to better understand why. You know, why are we doing this? Why do I have to go out there and get shot at? And then from that perspective, like the cultural standpoint, you can only teach Battle Drill 1 Alpha on a chalkboard so many times. Like, how about you sit down and you have a guy like Matt come in and talk to the entire company, E1 all the way up, about the area they're going to, what to expect, what's normal, what not to do to offend people, how to better ingratiate yourself with the locals, so that even when you're, you know, an E2 with a saw and you're pulling security and some kid walks up, what can you do to better solidify your presence as a positive thing in that kid's eyes? That would have been beneficial, I think, in a lot of ways. And that's kind of counterintuitive to the infantry's mission to begin with. Because, you know, day one of infantry school, you show up and the first thing you get pounded into your brain is kill. And, you know, but it wasn't, in a lot of ways, it wasn't an infantry fight. I mean, the fighting was an infantry fight. The presence of our forces there was not an infantry fight.
Right.
We weren't there to bomb shit and take over. We were there to maintain the status quo in a lot of ways.
And that's another thing that kind of like, I was like, man, I wish we had been turned loose just to fight. You know, I wish it had been like, hey, there's bad guys in the village, go seize the village, kick them out or kill them, and then come home.
Yeah.
But then on the flip side, I'm like, I would really wish we would have better understood and known the people and the culture. And the two aren't exactly compatible with each other. So I'm not really sure what the answer for sure is there, but I do think us doing joint patrols with the Afghan army was detrimental. I think they should have been autonomous U.S. patrols with, you know, the cultural support team or the interpreter, and let us do our missions, but let experienced advisors and the SF worry about getting the Afghan army ready. I wish I understood what the balance would be for us to get more of the cultural experience. But the good news is, I was PFC Grace, and it's not up to me.
Yeah, and that's another thing I got to catch myself when I start going down this little rabbit hole too. It's like there's a lot of privates out there who don't give a shit. Yeah, a lot of guys, the dude behind the saw is just there to get it on. He don't fucking care about, you know, connecting with somebody in some far and distant land. Not that he's not capable of it, or not that the majority would not, but, and that's, you know, that's not the infantry's purpose. So yeah, it almost like if we went and did something like a presence patrol, have a dedicated team of 6 people, a civil affairs soldier, a PSYOPs soldier, 2 Afghan interpreters, and a FET team or something that are dedicated towards cultivating those relationships and let us do the security work.
Yes.
And then when it comes to like moving to contact or hitting a hard target, leave the Afghans at home and we just roll up and fuck shit up.
Yeah. And it's hard.
It's a weird hypothetical wormhole in a lot of ways.
It's a very weird hypothetical wormhole, and it's, you know, there's stuff that we still don't know, that we don't understand, and we never will. As our nature of just where we were in the puzzle. But, you know, there's definitely things that being on the ground, being a grunt, seeing things as they're actually happening, not as they're being briefed or reported. You're just like, man, that just doesn't work. Yeah, I mean, I don't know if there's anything we could have done to make the Afghan army more ready for when we left. They never were going to be.
Yeah.
You know?
We definitely couldn't have. As like, in terms of just your average infantryman, there's nothing that guy could have done to make it better.
And I can't say that at any point during our 9 months on Sperlingar, I saw any progress.
No.
And in fact, I saw the opposite. I saw them get less of initiative, less willing to go out, less motivated, less capable, less competent, because they were scared, and they should be. They were getting fucked up.
Yeah, I think the only time I ever saw them really hyper motivated was when they caught those dudes sleeping and smoked them all.
When they committed a literal war crime.
Yeah. I don't think we told that story on the podcast, but the one more story.
I think we've alluded to it.
Basically, the Afghan army split off from us
because they were mad at us.
Because they were mad at us, and they didn't want to continue the patrol. There's a problem, and they stumbled across. Was it 5 Taliban?
So it was a few of them. I don't remember how many.
There's a few dudes literally napping in an orchard, but they were like sleeping like with their guns. Like they had obviously been out fighting and patrolling themselves, and they basically just butchered the guys. And
they stabbed them.
Stabbed them to death.
Yeah.
I just remember coming back and they were all hopped up and juiced up, and this guy was like miming, like sticking one of them.
I remember that. Yep.
Yeah, he was like, "It was amazing. I just got to slice this dude's throat open."
Well, that's actually a really good point with the importance of Afghan justice.
Afghan justice, yeah.
And the very blurry line between Afghan justice and war crimes. We place a lot of rules on war, and we should, because we're a civilized nation. We have the technology, we have the capability and responsibility to wage war responsibly and minimize civilian casualties and treat our enemies as the way that we would hope our enemies would treat us. Got it. It doesn't work like that in Afghanistan.
No, it much doesn't.
Strength is power. So when you have, this is a good time to talk about like General Raziq, and the influence that he carried over Kandahar. It wasn't because he was just a nice, smart guy. He was actually illiterate, we found out. But he was brutal when brutal was called for. And he was a politician when politics was called for. He was the kind of guy that if you took a confirmed Taliban to his compound and released into his custody, he was never heard from again. And that was something that the SF would threaten their detainees, like, hey, if you don't talk, we're going to take you to Raziq or Raziq, and then they would talk because they didn't want to go to Raziq because no one came back from Raziq. And there's an importance in Afghanistan for that kind of strength, that warlord strength. Whereas like, hey, you want this guy to be your friend. You don't want him to be your enemy. He can be a wonderful friend, but he's a terrible enemy. And it's not a coincidence that within a few months of him dying, they finally got the guy after like the 74th, assassination attempt, that the peace in Panjwai fell apart. So like we talk about these stories of, dropping detainees off at an Afghan base and hearing 3 gunshots as we drove away, or the literal video of the guy getting, murdered in the middle of Route Brown that we have, which the guy did go to jail for it. He probably got let out the back door, but that's besides the point. He shot a Taliban IED emplacer in the back with his hands bound in the middle of Route Brown.
Yeah.
Stuff like that happened. And, for us, we're like, oh my God, that's a war crime. But for them, it's like, well, that's, the only real difference between that and like us executing a prisoner is that our standard for evidence is a lot higher than theirs.
Mm-hmm.
You know, they caught the guy with the IED making materials. That's good enough for them to shoot him.
Yeah.
You know, for us, we require things like, you know, charges, a trial, an appeal, all that kind of stuff. For them, that was enough. So does that make that a war crime, or does that just make it a different justice system?
Mm. Yeah, I feel like there's kind of a glaring misunderstanding in terms of especially the higher level stuff, governmentally and even militarily to some degree. It's like our unwillingness to understand Afghan justice in balance with that long-term goal and that long-term vision.
Right.
So like, yeah, does the ALP dude dragging the guy out into the street and shooting him down because he caught him with HME, is that great? No, it's not great. Ideally, we would not like that to be how justice is handed out. But, you know, that's how it's being done. And instead of understanding that and finding the guy like Raziq or Raziq. So finding the guy like Raziq who didn't mind if girls went to school and didn't care if, you know, if a young lady went to Kabul for university. And then every once in a while he would do something a little dirty. Because the thing is in 15, 20 years, it doesn't matter because he's going to be dead because of assassination attempts or whatever. So that longevity of vision and balance with the current definition of Afghan justice was definitely not there.
And it goes back to they can't be an American democracy. It doesn't work. So we have to find a way for it to work within their culture to get them to a point where they're a modern society that's our ally. That should be the goal. You know, democracy, not so much. Like, who cares? Democracy is a pretty inefficient form of government, if we're being completely honest. Especially in a country like Afghanistan, where you have different tribes and you have different regions, 7 different languages. Like, my God. Like, you know, I'm not going to pretend to know what the answer is. I just know it's not American democracy.
Yeah.
And there needs to be a little bit of, you know, moral flexibility on what the leaders of that country are going to be doing. You know, there's going to be some corruption. There's going to be some distasteful things. Like, you know, General Abrams said it perfectly. He's like, no one is 100% one way or the other. I'm happy if I get somebody that's 90% in our category, and I can not worry so much about the 10% where they're not.
I mean, it was a war of misunderstanding in a lot of ways. I mean, considering how well it started off, it's a shame that it became what it was, because it could have been a success story, I think, in a lot of ways, but just a litany
like you
of
said,
misunderstandings.
We had to stay.
Yeah.
And that's a really controversial statement, because if you'd asked me a year and a half ago we should stay, I would like, nah, fuck it, let's just leave. Not because, I don't know, it was like I was like oblivious to what the consequences of that would be. I just like, man, we've just been doing it for too long. If you look in the context of like Japan, South Korea, Germany, England, like we've been there for 70 years.
Yeah.
Why? What's the problem with having two military bases in Afghanistan? You know, and easing to the fact where we just do training missions there. You know, and the Afghans can deal with their own stuff. Yeah, it's, you know, you're right. I mean, you had to commit to 20, 40, 60 years. Eventually just stop calling it a war. Just call it an overseas posting. You know, it's not a deployment anymore. It's a PCS. You know, work towards that, but yeah, we didn't commit, and that's, you know, for better or worse, the war is over. Yeah, our war is over until we go back.
I don't know if we will, man. I don't know.
Man, it would take a. Let's take back. We're not going to send conventional forces back to occupy ground in Afghanistan in the next 20 years. I wouldn't guess. I'm sure we've been back. I'm sure some of Zach's friends have paid a couple visits already, but you know, there's stuff I'm sure that was left behind that shouldn't have been, and that kind of thing. But you know, as we kind of, you know, we've talked about what we experienced, about the podcast, about the information that we learned along the way, what we would have done differently. You know, what do you see as the future for Panjwai?
I mean, unfortunately, there is no future for Panjwai in a lot of ways. It'll be under the thumb of Taliban control, and everything that we went there to try and do is kind of for a moot point in a lot of ways. It'll always be their birth, their birth ground, their home ground. So I feel like they're never going to let Panjwai be one of the last places, or one of the first places that goes towards a particular kind of any other kind of enemy they might have, or develops past what they're going to let it become. Yeah, so I mean, it's probably pretty dark in a lot of ways, and that's okay. I mean, we tried our best.
Right. When I think about it, I think basically there's like kind of two tiers to what happens to Panjwai in the future. The first is that while Taliban is in command of Afghanistan, or is the primary contender for leadership of Afghanistan, no one's going to go to Panjwai to fight them.
Yeah.
They'll fight over Kabul, they'll fight over Ghazni and Gardez and Tarin Kowt and Herat. Some of these places where they might possibly win the civilian population and kick them out.
Mm-hmm.
They're not going to go to Panjwai. There's no point. It's not strategic for as far as the country goes for an internal war.
Mm-hmm.
That's the phase one. The phase two is that at some point the Taliban will no longer be the governing body of Afghanistan. I don't know when that's going to be, but it's going to happen.
Mm.
And when that happens, then basically, Panjwai is where they're going to go to lick their wounds.
Mm-hmm.
And that's where, and Panjwai is just kind of going to become southeastern Kentucky. It's going to be this place where people live that refuse to join the larger society. That's where it's like, the South after the Civil War.
Mm.
The Confederate soldiers and all that stuff, they went back to the South and they stayed entrenched in their ways and fought progressive change for decades. And that's just kind of where they're going to go to lick their wounds. And progress is going to be slow in Panjwai.
Mm-hmm.
I think even if the Taliban was overthrown this year by the NRF, it'd still be 10 years before Panjwai was ever somewhere that made a positive progression towards being a modern, society.
Mm-hmm.
Which obviously is super fucking bleak. Obviously I'm wearing our shirt says it was not a waste, and I don't want people to watch this and think like, oh great, well it's just gonna be fucking backwards and Taliban failed for 20-30 years. What the fuck was the point of going and losing my leg or watching my buddy get killed? Because there's this wonderful thing about places. No matter what place it is in the world, you can fucking leave. So if there is progress being made in other parts of the countries because of the work that we did for 20 years, and people that were in Panjwai remember it, and they leave Panjwai and they go to Kabul, or they go to Peshawar, or they go to Herat, or they go to anywhere, and they leave, eventually those people, they get education and they come back. That what we did is the key to these people educating themselves, modernizing themselves, and saving their country. Will Panjwai itself be saved? Maybe not. Maybe it will. Maybe we'll be surprised. But I refuse to believe that our time was wasted there. I think that we made an impression on the people there, positive or negative, make your pick. That's going to affect the future of that area. And it's too soon to say what that effect is.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, that's something I thought about too. Is like, if everything that we did there, and by we I mean like NATO forces did there, allowed just a handful of the people to get a glimpse of what life is like outside of Panjwai, then it wasn't a waste. If there's a one person that comes out of that place and does something good for the benefit of the people around them because of our presence there, then that's what it has to be, right? Because anything else wise is defeat and giving up, and we refuse to do that. So,
and if you were to summarize briefly what your time in Panjwai meant to you, how would you describe that?
That's kind of an impossible question.
I'm still asking it.
There's 50 episodes to get the summary, the brief summary.
Right.
I think for me, it was the largely positive impact that it can have on my day-to-day life. And that's something that I've, it ebbs and flows, but there's so much positive that can come out of that experience that can help me in my day-to-day. That's something I want to focus on, It was a formative experience in that it completely changed my mind, I think, for the better. I didn't fully realize that until doing this process, how it had changed my mind. And it was a foundational experience in that, like, there was before Panjwai and there was after Panjwai. Before Panjwai, I was a particular kind of person. And after Panjwai, I was a particular kind of person. And that after Panjwai, Luke is a better dude in a lot of ways. And he's a more solid guy in a lot of ways because, one of the greatest gifts of going to war is being pushed to the extreme edge of your mortality. And to be able to come back from that extreme edge with your mind intact is a wonderful gift because there's so many things in life that, while stressful and while annoying or whatever it may be, that it's okay. It's okay because you're not going to walk out there and get your shit blown up or get shot, or you're not going to have to sweat 4 gallons of water. Like, it's all right. It's not that big of a deal to take care of this mundane thing in your day-to-day life because you have that measure by which you can compare it to. So in that regard, it's a very useful experience, and that no matter what I do, nothing will be as hard as that 9 months there. And while everything has a different kind of way it affects us, nothing will be as hard as just that grind. And I'm glad that I have that because it's giving me that strong foundation to build on and to pursue the next thing.
Yeah, I'd have to say I agree with you. As it kind of setting the baseline for what you're capable of. Mm-hmm. We've talked in the past about why do men sign up, and now women sign up for combat arms? Why do they choose the infantry? Why do they choose special forces? Why do they choose to fly an Apache helicopter? One thing we came to was that at some point, a young man wants to test himself.
Yeah.
He wants to know what he's capable of. He wants to know how he'll react. I was curious. I chose a combat MOS because I wanted to know what it was like. But not so much like what it was like. I could envision being shot at. Like, that wasn't a hard thing to, picture. But how would I respond to it? I had no idea. And now I know. So for me, what Panjwai meant to me, it was the definition of what I'm capable of as a man. The types of emotions that I can process, the type of experiences that I can compartmentalize or I can deal with, the physical feats that I'm capable of, the moral ambiguity that I can work through when it involves the lives of other people. My ability to think quickly and adapt to situations. All of these things are things that I've learned in combat. Most of them on that 2012 deployment to Panjwai. Some of them came later, in 2017, but mainly because I just had more responsibilities then, so you learn different lessons. But, for me, what Panjwai meant was essentially the framing of my character as a man. And just, that's shaped me going forward, and it changed me. Certainly, as I think it changes everybody. I used to be a very patient person, a very soft-spoken person, not much of a risk taker, and I'm still really not much of a risk taker, but I'm more inclined to when the occasion calls for it now. But I think it's, like you said, it's formative, and it's, yeah, I think that would be how I describe what it means to me.
Yeah. And, it should, because, something that I've we talked about this a little bit the other day outside of the podcast, but sometimes I'll have these moments where I'll realize how exceptional it was because we've normalized it by talking about it for 52 episodes. But previously starting the podcast, I suppressed it for 10 years. But sometimes I'll have that weird little like semi out of body experience where I'll realize like that was an exceptional circumstance. Like waving down a helicopter of PJs and loading your buddy who's missing a leg up because he stepped on a bomb is not a normal thing. And so to kind of learn to value the exceptional nature of it has been very good, very, very productive and lucrative in that regard because, you know, it was an exceptional time. And there's a reason that people, unfortunately, let themselves become so inherently wrapped up into those experiences because of the exceptional nature of it. So, you know, finding that balance between letting it be, like you said, that foundation and not letting it be the only thing is a good balance to find. And when you do, it's going to reap very, very many beneficial things in your life.
I think a great way to, when you said that, what came to my mind is what you experienced was unique, but you are not special for having experienced it. You have a unique experience and you have seen things in other scenes. You've experienced things other people haven't experienced. But you in of yourself aren't special because of it. Yeah. You just have a different skill set, a different experience set than the person next to you. You know, especially as you go on in your life, you're going to meet exceptional people. You're going to meet people that have won, you know, awards for poetry or can speak 7 languages or, you know, lived in Aruba for 9 years or have these really unique experiences. And you have a unique experience too. Just don't think that it's any better than anybody else's. It's place it, you know, in its context, where it belongs. I think that's a really great way to look at it. Yeah, I think, you know, to those listening and watching, value your combat experience. It gives you something somebody else doesn't have. It makes you unique, not special. Yeah, definitely embrace that. You know, as we, you know, start to come full circle here, my next question for you, Luke, is what has the podcast meant to you as a host and as, you know, a veteran?
I feel like the greatest gift of doing this podcast has been me coming to a better understanding of what that experience did to me and how it impacted me, for better and for worse. It's just, I feel like I was so determined to not be the veteran. You know, I talked about it before, but many times I would go entire semesters and classmates had no idea that I was even in the military because I didn't want that to be a part of my identity. But the podcast for me has been this process of kind of like reconnecting with not only the memories and the experience of Panjwai, but just like that part of myself that will always be there, no matter how much maybe 6 or 7 years ago I didn't want it to be there, which is like, you know, this is a word. I hate to use this word because our society has bastardized it, but to connect with that warrior that is always a part of who I am, and to, instead of letting that fester and become a wound, I'm able to allow that to be a solid, integral part of my being. And the podcast has facilitated me connecting with that warrior that is in my makeup. And instead of trying to ignore it, I can lean into it and accept it and find the many benefits that come from letting that be a part of your personhood. So it's been rewarding in that regard. And it's also on a personal level, it's helped me to understand how I was mishandling a lot of the negative experiences and memories. I feel like I suppressed everything for so long that I'm having to rake over some hard memories. And the podcast opened the door for a path of healing for me in that regard. You know, the refusal to align myself with things like PTSD and things like that, has that refusal and that kind of contrariness has been dismantled by the podcast, because it's opened my eyes to some ways that experience is affecting me in potentially negative ways. And now I feel like I'm getting ahead of the curve, and that I'm wanting to alleviate those negative things and become better because of it. So the podcast has helped me out in that regard a lot. And so I think those two fronts is where it's really, really changed a lot for me. The person I am now versus the person I am 18 months ago when we started this thing is different. And a lot of that is owed to the podcast, and I'm thankful for that. So how about you?
So I think like you, there's a couple aspects. One is, on a superficial layer, understanding the experience for what it was. Prior to the podcast, I wasn't quite as to the extreme as you. It was like, hey, it's a thing that happened. I went through it. It sucked. It was pretty tough, but others had it way worse, and it's really not worth going into. And talking to all these guests, people who served in different eras, different areas, it really kind of helped for me understand that it was an exceptional experience. It was not normal. It was not normal for combat. It was a truly unique combat experience on the level of Korengal, Helmand, Sadr City, Ramadi. These very unique moments in the War on Terror. Combat in Panjwai in 2012 was right there, in terms of it being extraordinary. That doesn't make it better or worse than any of those. It just stands out. It's not a typical combat deployment. That was one thing that I didn't give any credence to, because I didn't think that kind of thinking was healthy to want to rank your experience. But it's one thing that came out. I was like, hey, if you served in Panjwai, you deserve a pat on the back, because it was exceptional and it was harder than other places. And it's a shame that more people haven't told their stories from Panjwai, because it's kind of the untold story of the War on Terror, which is ironic because the people we're fighting are from there. It'd be like fighting a war against the people of America and neglecting to mention Washington, D.C. or something. That's one thing. The other thing was, letting go. And that was something that I've had to deal with in the past when I had to stop flying. Letting go of flying. And for this process, letting go of my emotions that were attached to combat in Panjwai. We joked about how the first 10 episodes we were getting super emotional, and doing an interview was a emotionally taxing experience. When we would finish probably in the first season, every episode be like, dude, I need a beer. And I've already had 3. And as it went on, it became more procedural. I could talk about these things and these incredibly emotional and traumatic experiences without getting emotionally worked up, because I had worked through it. The podcast has turned out to be 100-hour therapy session. So that's been super, super rewarding. The effect that it's had on other people. The messages that we receive, the comments that we receive, the people that reach out and email us and tell us how much it means to them to have part of their story told, even if we don't even tell them their story. The fact that we're talking about Panjwai in a medium that more than just Panjwai veterans can access, so that their families can understand, and that it's up there forever, and that, someone is finally telling the stories of Panjwai, and to see how much it means to people. And then also, how it's been beneficial for the guys that were there and the families of those that we lost. So to see how many guys are taking their mental health seriously and going to get help. I won't say names, but there was one guest in particular that was having a very tough time, and he refused to get help. And it was because of his participation in the podcast that kind of put him over the edge, and he went and got help. That, to me, if that was the only thing that happened on the podcast, the whole thing is worth it. The people of Afghanistan. We've talked about it a little bit, but as a result of this podcast, we were in a position to help.
Mm-hmm.
We weren't able to help everybody, unfortunately, and that's something I have to live with. But we did help people get out. We were in a position to help some people get out of Afghanistan. And that is something that also, in my opinion, justifies the entire project. That we were able to raise $5,500 through this community. I mean, that's not an insignificant amount of money. You had like 9line, which is a huge clothing company, doing a fundraiser at the same time we did ours. They raised like $350. We raised $5,500. Which means that we didn't raise just $5,500. That was just the profits. It was like $9,000 worth of merchandise sales to generate that profit, which is incredible. And that was you guys. That was our friends, our family, our followers, who not only believed in us and what we were doing as a podcast, but they trusted us enough to select a charity that was going to get to the right people to help people who were in need at that time. That response from our community meant a lot to me. And finally, I have to say what meant the most to me about this experience was getting to share it with you. Luke has been my best friend 10 years now. He's the one guy I've stayed in touch from our company from the moment, even though he didn't want it at first. I'm his best friend by just forcing him to, apparently. But to be able to go down this journey as business partners, as co-hosts, as co-founders, to work together and to create this really beautiful project together has been a fantastic journey in friendship, and I'm thankful for it.
Me too, man. Yeah, I mean, I'm eternally thankful for your friendship and the journey that we've gotten to do this together. Like, there's no other person on Spearman Car that I would have done this with. and credit where credit is due. I often joke that I'm not the co-founder. I'm the 1/8 co-founder of Panjwai Podcast, because Curtis is the fuel that drives this thing. I just show up and get all the glory. So, people listening, like, Curtis edits. He does the social media stuff. He's very much the guts of how successful this has been, and everything when it came to getting people out of Afghanistan was on Curtis's shoulder. I was the emotional support. So yeah, man, it's been really awesome to do it with you as well, because we've solidified our friendship. It's funny because I was talking with Leah with this a while back, and due to some recent stuff that you and I have been through together as well. She was like, you guys have she's like, not only are you just good friends and best friends, she's like, you guys have been through not just shit together, but you've been through real shit together. Yeah, I feel like, and people throw it around a lot, but for us to have gone through so much shit together has been, and then to be able to produce something like this as a joint effort has been awesome, man. And I agree. I think that doing it with you was a great reward. And it's taken what was already a really exceptional friendship and solidified it into an even better friendship. So that's been awesome.
Yeah, I appreciate that, man.
Yeah.
Kind of, I'm gonna do to us what we do to all of our guests as we close out this episode and as we close out the project. And give you the floor to say whatever it is that you want to say. I mean, we kind of have already done that, but this is it. This is the final words of the Panjwai podcast. Luke, the floor is yours.
I think the first place that my mind goes to is just be better. Be a better veteran. We can all do it. I'm guilty of it. We all are guilty of it. But we can use those experiences to we have two choices. We can either dwell in the misery and the pain and allow that to dominate our lives, or even dwell in the self-hero worship and allow that to dominate our lives, or we can move on and be better because of and not in spite of the experiences that places like Panjwai give us in our lives. So it's a challenge for myself too. Like be better by it and be better because of it. And so I think my final words would be, if you are a veteran of Panjwai, recognize, internalize, value, and then be better because of the experiences that you had. The floor is now yours, Curtis.
All right. The final word. I'd be remiss not to bring it back to the Afghan people to start. We have told, 52 episodes worth of stories and anecdotes and thoughts and opinions. But when the door shuts on my way out of the studio today, there's still 38 million people living in Afghanistan that have to deal with the aftermath of this war. And we shouldn't forget them. I know I won't. The ones that I still haven't gotten out, I'm still going to try to get them out when those opportunities arise. But we shouldn't be so arrogant to believe that because the war is over, that Afghanistan is over. It's not. So that's one thing. Remember that there are still people there. There are people here that have been displaced here as a result of the fall of Afghanistan. And I challenge everyone to help them whenever you get the opportunity to. Without going political, I just think that it's our responsibility. We created a situation that required these people to leave their homes. And we bear a responsibility to help them succeed. So that's one. Second, I want to echo what you were saying. Be better. Tell your stories. If we didn't get to tell it somehow else. Find a way to tell your story. Write a book. Do your own podcast. Maybe if it's just an episode, just record your story for yourself. Put it on a shelf. I don't care what you do. But if you feel you need to talk to somebody, tell your story. And do it in such a way that enhances the experience instead of, don't be a braggart and don't go listen down your ORB of all the awards that you got. Nobody cares. Be better. Tell your story. And I guess the final thing that I want to leave with is that we didn't all come home. And I wanted to take a moment to just throw out some names and stories, or not stories, but anecdotes of some of the men that we lost, and hopefully we can keep those stories alive. From our deployment, we had, Master at Arms 2 Sean Brazes. So on his first combat deployment with his dog, Sicario. Super happy to be there, going on this big clearing operation. He was killed in action on May 30th, 2012. Corporal Bryant J. Luxmore, who was killed by small arms fire on June 10th, 2012, while leading his dismounted patrol. Specialist Trevor Pinnock, who was killed on June 12th, 2012, when he stepped on a improvised explosive device that was a trap designed specifically for EOD or engineer personnel trying to exploit a fake IED in a tree. He did this in front of one of our patrols to keep them safe. In the same explosion, wounded was Sergeant Joseph Lilly, who succumbed to his wounds on June 14th, 2012. On September 20th, 2012, we lost Jason Swindle to an RPG attack. He was in an MATV. The Taliban launched an RPG that hit the broadside of that MATV, penetrated the armor, and killed him instantly. But they live on in our memories. They live on in the memories of those who served with them, in the memories of their families. And this project is dedicated to them. This is their legacy, those who served and did not return from Panjwai. In fact, I'll dedicate it to them and the Afghan people, because the rest of us get to live our lives and to do something else. But the people of Afghanistan and those whose lives ended there, or at their life is bookmarked in some way by Panjwai. And I would leave you guys with this, as Luke said: be better, live your lives as an exceptional human being. Like, constantly try and be better, because of the guys and women who are unable to do so because they gave their lives.
Absolutely. And with that, I think is the fitting end to the Panjwai Podcast.
Yeah. Maybe we'll see you around. Maybe we won't.
Cheers, buddy.
Cheers.
Coffee, milk, and sunrises, that old Avon Road boat, childhood of tree climbing, stories of Vietnam. Bless your feet in the sawgrass, whistling swamp pop gold, catching fish, watch the birds pass, taught me all that I know. All that I can hope is you take me with you when you go. Guess I should have known I can't leave with you when you go. I miss the melody of your cackling laughter, coming from your chest when I hurt myself. Gossip across the cane when you disagree, but hearing those words were like hymns to me. All that I can hope is you take me with you when you go. Guess I should have known I can't leave with you when you go. Now Cow Island is awfully quiet, with your screen door staying closed. And if I learned French like you told me, baby, I'm praying for you both.
Take me with you when you go.
I said I'm praying for you both.
Take me with you when you go.
I said I'm praying for you both.
Take me with you when you go.
I said I'm praying for you both.
Take me with you when you go.